So there's an old saying, if you come at the king, don't miss, otherwise you'll get your balls chopped off and shoved in your mouth. Which is exactly what happened to Simon de Montfort, who took on King Henry III of England and lost. Simon and Henry hadn't always been arch enemies though, as they had actually started off as besties. Simon was a French knight who had come to England to claim his inheritance of the earldom of Leicester, and Henry took an instant liking to him. He was charismatic, ambitious, a crusader, and a man of action. It was right at the time that Henry needed powerful allies as well, as his barons weren't too fond of him as he spunked their money up the wall trying and failing twice to reclaim lost English lands in France. Henry even liked Simon so much that he let him marry the most valuable bride in England, his sister, giving him the lands and titles to go with it, elevating him to one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. However, Simon overplays his hand. He takes out a huge loan using the king as a guarantor, however he forgets to ask Henry for his permission in the first place. Henry explodes at him in a rage and exiles him and his wife out of the kingdom. However, Simon's back 3 years later as Henry is once again in need of his talents. Henry drags Simon into another French campaign that ends in humiliating failure, and Simon's pissed. He tells Henry to his face that he should be locked up like Charles the Simple, a French king who got imprisoned by his own subjects for being so bad on the battlefield. However, Henry can't be too mad at his buddy because he needs him, appointing him Lieutenant of Gascony, England's only held lands in France remaining, where he's there to crush rebels and secure its borders against the French. However, he's a bit too ruthless in his rule, the Gascons complain, Henry recalls him, and the two have another lover's tiff. It wasn't just Simon Henry was pissing off, it was his barons as well, as Henry surrounded himself with his violent family members, his half-brothers the Lusignans, who looted, murdered and stole as they pleased, and Henry even protected them with his royal authority. However, Henry was about to do something even dumber. Henry had promised the Pope he'd fund the conquest of Sicily, which was over 1,000 miles away because the Pope offered him the vacant crown. And Henry, wanting an empire like his ancestors and wanting to crusade, jumped at the bit, even betting his mortal soul on it, as if England went back on their obligation to fund this crusade, they'd all get excommunicated. And now Henry begged all of his barons for money to do it. Simon's back and he's leading the barons to stop Henry's madness and to call him a fucking idiot, forcing him in 1258 to sign the Provisions of Oxford, a document which handed power back to the barons and take it away from the king, humiliating Henry in the process. However, only a few years later, Henry's wriggled out of the provisions with the Pope's approval. However, Simon's having none of it. He now raises an army to take on the king, plunging England into civil war. At the Battle of Lewes, Simon, who has a broken leg, and his force, who's outnumbered over 2 to 1, spectacularly beats off the king, taking him and his son Prince Edward captive in the process. Simon's come at the king and didn't miss, now using Henry as a puppet ruler. However, his son, the young Prince Edward, is a lot smarter than his father. Under house arrest, Edward plays an ingenious game with his captors while riding horses. He wants to find out which horse is the fastest, and once he's found out which horse is the fastest, he rides off into the sunset as the other ones can't catch up with him, and he now starts raising an army to take on Simon. The barons, scared Simon might take the throne for himself, flock to Edward as he promises them they can keep their provisions and reforms. We're at Evesham, the two sides meet, and Simon, who still holds the king captive, dresses him in de Montfort colours as he's saying if he loses the battle and dies, he hopes the king's mistaken for one of his soldiers as well and is killed too. Simon's force, once again outnumbered over 2 to 1, charges into the fray, and it's over pretty quickly. As one chronicler describes it, the murder of Evesham, for battle it was none. Simon watches on as his eldest son is killed before announcing it is time to die then, as Edward has appointed a 12-man hit squad to stalk the battlefield, find Simon and kill him, as most of his soldiers as well are slaughtered for daring to take on the king. Simon's taken out by a lance to the neck, and then his body's mutilated with his limbs cut off, his bollocks cut off and hung from each nostril and then stuffed in his mouth, with his head then paraded on a spear. The king in the Montfort's colours is just about rescued in the melee, and the victory saw baronial opposition to him come to an end. However, Simon's legacy lived on as the reforms he placed on Henry were the first makings of English Parliament. So was the leper king Baldwin IV the baddest bitch in the Holy Land? Well, his story is certainly one of the most tragic, as he was thrust onto the throne aged 13 despite his body falling apart, and he still managed to hold together something crumbling more than him, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Baldwin was appointed the tutor William of Tyre to prepare him for kingship. However, William soon noticed something was wrong with Baldwin when he was aged 9, as he was playing games with the other children, pinching each other's arms to see who could take the most pain. Baldwin didn't show any discomfort, and they thought at first this was a sign of kingly endurance. It wasn't strength though, it was the early stages of leprosy, a horrible incurable disease that led to a person's body slowly rotting and decaying. The heir to the throne of Jerusalem had just been given a death sentence. Due to the stigma lepers face of being ostracised, they didn't want to diagnose it straight away as the symptoms were not yet fully clear, and they hoped it wasn't as feared. Baldwin was treated by the best physicians available and still trained to be king, being taught to ride on horseback using only his legs so he could use his one good arm to swing a sword. Behind the scenes though, a husband was trying to be secured for his only legitimate sibling, his older sister Sibylla, so when King Amalric died, the throne could pass through her to a functioning candidate. However, he unexpectedly passed away of dysentery in 1174, and at age only 13, Baldwin was crowned King of Jerusalem on the 75th anniversary of when the First Crusade conquered Jerusalem. Everyone knew he was sick with something at this point, but he was the best option. His sister was still unmarried, and any rival candidate could potentially lead to civil war. The new king though was still 2 years away from a majority, with Raymond III of Tripoli running the show, agreeing a truce with Saladin who had just united Syria and Egypt, and he must have been licking his lips at the prospect of a fractured Crusader state run by a child of leprosy, with Baldwin's condition massively worsening during the regency. When Baldwin assumed the majority aged 15, he wasted no time trying to curb the Sultan's power, leading massive raiding parties into Muslim territory. While many Crusader forces were attacking Muslim cities in the north, Saladin had been amassing a force in Egypt expecting a Christian invasion. However, when that never came, he was now free to waltz in from the south, catching Baldwin completely off guard with his pants down. At the time, Baldwin was seriously ill after visiting Sibylla's new husband who had just died a year after marrying her, leaving her a pregnant widow, as he panicked, scrambling any troops he could, with one contemporary putting it, "He may have been looking like a corpse, but he wasn't a little bitch." With only a few hundred troops and a couple thousand soldiers, Baldwin's force was massively outnumbered as they hid behind the defensive walls of Ascalon, now leaving Saladin free to make a play towards Jerusalem. However, the Sultan severely underestimated the Christian forces, thinking they'd cower behind their walls. He let his army spread out to forage and raid, not keeping an eye on the city. A devastating mistake as Baldwin's forces pounced and beat off Saladin with the ferocity of a handjob from a leper. The Battle of Montgisard in 1177 became Baldwin's defining moment. Aged only 16 and covered in bandages, he charged into the fray on horseback with the true cross behind him, inflicting on Saladin one of his worst career defeats to date. The following year saw a grinding stalemate between the two powers, with Baldwin organising the defence of his kingdom to great effect. However, the real threat to him wasn't Saladin, it was his less than secure crown. As Baldwin couldn't smash and make an heir due to his rotting pee-pee, it was essential Sibylla remarried so the crown could pass to someone who wasn't actively decaying or wasn't a child, with Baldwin picking Guy of Lusignan, a French knight who had freshly arrived in Jerusalem, much to the protests of other lords. Baldwin still clung on to power though, as few trusted Guy's untested martial and political ability, with it feared civil war break out if he took power. However, Baldwin's body was failing him. He was now completely blind and unable to walk, but he was still mentally vigorous, striving to defend his kingdom. But then came another illness for Baldwin, and thinking it was his end, Guy was reluctantly made regent, but his performance in the field against Saladin just wasn't it. When Baldwin miraculously recovered, he fell out with Guy, and with the pressure from his nobles, he disinherited him, crowning his 5-year-old nephew, Baldwin V, co-king. It had no effect on the stability of the realm though, as one onlooker put it, "One of our kings is a cripple and one's a child. What use can they do?" The only positives for them was that Guy was now out of the picture. Illness soon struck again for our leper king, and this time it was his end, passing away in 1185, aged either 23 or 24. His reign was scarred by political chaos, an ever-growing threat of Saladin, and a succession crisis. But even as his body failed him, his courage did not, leading from the front where others would hide behind their scars, holding together the kingdom of Jerusalem only by a thread, even through some controversial decisions, where only 3 years after he passed, the holy city fell. So who was the greatest military leader ever in the history of ever? Well, one who could take the cake is Jan Zizka, undefeated in every battle he ever fought in, despite being half blind and then fully blind, all while revolutionising medieval warfare. Zizka burst onto the scene in 1419 during a Hussite uprising in Bohemia, where angry protesters in Prague yeeted Catholic councillors out of the window in what would become the first of 3 times in history people were thrown out of the window in Prague during an uprising. The Hussites were followers of Jan Hus, a Czech priest who had grown disillusioned with the corruption within the Catholic Church, especially them having 2 popes, even 3 at one point, and he began preaching for reformation. Of course the church didn't like this, denounced him as a heretic, and then burned him at the stake in 1415. The Hussites of course weren't too happy and began causing a ruckus, blaming one man, King Sigismund of Hungary, who invited Hus to a council under the guise of reform, but then handed him over to the Catholics for a barbecue, and now he was claiming he would drown every Hussite in Bohemia. His brother Wenceslaus IV was already king of Bohemia, however apparently the shock of the window yeeting caused him to pass away and now Siggy claimed the crown, which the Hussites were having none of. Sigismund wanting to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, which needed the Pope's approval, meant he cozied up to the Pope, and when the Pope called for a crusade against these heretics, Sigismund gladly accepted it, where in 1420 they besieged Prague. Enter our man Jan Zizka to lead the resistance, a 60-year-old grizzled veteran and a military genius who spent much of his early life as an outlaw and mercenary, losing the use of one eye at an early age, although it's unsure how, with the Zizka part of his name likely a reference to this as it wasn't a family name. His army was a bunch of peasants, craftsmen and farmers with little to no military training, although what they did know how to use was agricultural tools. One of Zizka's great innovations was to turn the agricultural flail into a weapon of war, as if you can beat your wheat, you can beat your meat. The meat in this situation being an armoured knight getting twatted round the head. He also armed them with weapons which required little to no training, such as crossbows and early firearms, with Zizka being one of the first innovators of gunpowder technology on the battlefield, and while it was still horribly inaccurate, it would have made even the hardest soldiers of the time shit their pants as it let off a terrifying roar. At Prague, with less than 100 troops, Zizka defended wooden fortifications atop Witkov Hill, which controlled the eastern route into the city, and the Crusaders, numbering 7,000 to 8,000, thought these Hussites were an absolute joke and this would be an easy battle. However, they probably hadn't heard of Zizka's undefeated record. The steepness of the hill funneled the Crusaders into one narrow path where apparently the ferocity of one woman Hussite soldier inspired their resistance, with reinforcements soon coming in on their flank and the Crusaders routing, with Hussites decisively beating them off and reclaiming Prague. While victory at Witkov was absolutely extraordinary, Zizka's real masterpiece came a few months before at the Battle of Neckmere and Sudomir, where he deployed one of the greatest battlefield innovations yet, which allowed a bunch of peasants to take on some of the finest knights in Europe. The Wagenburg. The Wagenburg was a bunch of cart wagons, enhanced defensively and then chained together to form a defensive square or circle, and these were operated by teams of roughly 20, including crossbowmen, gunners, drivers, shield bearers, pikemen, and then flail wielders with cannons in between them. Ditches were then dug in front of these wagons, because of course a great leader like Zizka would know, if you dig ditches, you get bitches. Once morale of the enemy was completely broken, these wagons would then open up, unleashing hordes of angry, flail-wielding peasants to chase you down and beat you round the head, as the Hussites weren't too fond of chivalric codes and didn't take too many prisoners, meaning the armies that faced them suffered huge losses. Their religious war soon suffered its first hiccup though, as when besieging Raby Castle in 1421, Zizka suffered an arrow to his other eye, his good eye, and now he was completely blind in both eyes, taking him out of action for a few months. Sigismund now found this the perfect time to launch a second anti-Hussite crusade. At Kutna-Hora, it seems Zizka's string of victories was finally about to end, as he was sandwiched between a hostile town and Sigismund's forces. However, our man always has a plan, and at nightfall he aimed his cannons at the weakest point in Sigismund's line. After a significant gap was made, under the cover of darkness, Zizka rolled his war wagons through the line in the first mobile artillery move ever in history, escaping certain death, where he returned a few weeks later with reinforcements and crushed the crusading force. The Hussite movement was beginning to fracture though, between two rival factions, the Taborites, led by Zizka, who were more radical, and the Utrechists, who were more moderate in the reform they wanted. At the Battle of Malosov in 1423, Zizka beat the Utraquist force because of course he did, he's Jan Zizka, he doesn't lose. And then he turned his attention east to liberate the Hussites in Moravia. However, this was one frontier too far and Zizka finally lost the battle. To illness. With legend having it, he wanted his skin flayed and turned into a drum so he could still lead his men. And although this story is absolutely amazing, it probably isn't true. Zizka's troops now referred to themselves as the orphans upon loss of their leader, with the Hussite wars carrying on for a further 10 years where the moderate Hussites eventually won out and were able to practice their religion. His enemies said upon his passing, the one whom no mortal hand could destroy was extinguished by the finger of God. So who was the baddest bitch of the Middle Ages? Well, one who could take all the marbles is William Marshal, often regarded as the greatest knight who ever lived, serving 5 English kings and surviving all the medieval world had to throw at him. William's first taste of this cruel world comes in 1152 at the age of 5 during the English Civil War known as the Anarchy. He's handed over as hostage to King Stephen, who threatens to launch young Willie at a castle via trebuchet because Daddy Marshal's not surrendering it, to which his father responds, "Go on then, he's only my second son, I can make more." Luckily, Stephen had a bit more empathy, sparing small Willie, where the following year after the war ended he was shipped off to Normandy to begin his path to knighthood. He gets knighted as 20 just as Normandy's invaded, and in his first taste of combat, he valiantly beats off numerous opponents. However, he gets laughed at for it because he doesn't take any loot and all he has to show for it is a dead horse. It was a harsh lesson, but his rise to fame from Povo Knight continued as he crushed the competition and earned a small fortune entering the medieval tournament when knights could hone their skills for battle. Big Willie's skills earned him an escort mission for the English Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine in France. However, his squad's ambushed, and as he valiantly tries to beat off more ambushers, he's penetrated from behind, in the leg, by a giant member and taken captive. Luckily, Big Willie escapes this penetration without infection, and Eleanor, so impressed by his bravery, pays his ransom, where she soon puts him to work as the tutor for her first son and King Henry II's heir, the young King Henry. The young King Henry had been crowned co-king by his father, however he refused to give his son any lands and make him a nepo baby, so Henry rebels, and even with Big Willie at his side, old King Henry puts down the rebellion and they kiss and make up. The next few years saw William and young Henry's friendship blossom as they entered the tournament scene and absolutely crushed it, becoming some of the finest knights in Europe. However, there's a rumbling in the jungle. Apparently, William slept with the young king's wife. Outraged as William's exiled, but it soon all blows over as young Henry needs some good men at his side as he's once again declared war on one of his family members. This time it's his brother who controls Aquitaine and young Henry wants a piece of that pie. Unfortunately for young Hennes, he catches dysentery and then dies, and the devastated Marshal on his deathbed promises to fulfil young Henry's crusading vow, where the next 2 years William spent it in the Holy Land, but what he got up to in those 2 years is apparently not important enough for any chronicler to write about. Big Willie's now back in Europe and harder than ever before, now serving his third king, the old King Henry II, who's once again fallen out of one of his sons, this time Richard, were at a skirmish. William and Richard charge at each other on horseback. Richard's unarmoured, but at the final moment in the charge, William spares his life, altering the lance and skewering his horse instead, apparently being the only man ever to unhorse the future Lionheart. Old Henry soon passes away, and upon Richard's ascendancy to the throne, he knows how useful a man of Marshal's experience is to have around, so he rewards him with a mega rich wife with all of these lands, just showing how far Big Willie's rose to prominence. When Richard returns from the Crusades, he fights alongside William in Normandy against the French. However, Marshals, going through kings faster than Henry VIII's going through wives, as now Richard is struck by a crossbow and dies of infection. Richard's brother John gets the full support of Willie, even after losing the lands in Normandy to the French, falling out of Marshal, and then forcibly trying to take his lands off him in Ireland. But in classic John style, he fails to take those lands and pisses off even more barons in the process, where they force him eventually to sign some concessions in the Magna Carta, which is basically binned off about 5 minutes after it's been sealed. Throughout this all, Marshal somehow stayed loyal to John, where the First Barons' War breaks out, but John soon dies of dysentery, and Marshal makes another deathbed promise. It's to secure the crown for John's 9-year-old son Henry III, where at the age of 70 in the Battle of Lincoln, pensioner Willie beats off the baronial forces with his free bus pass and secures the crown for the Royalists. It's Big Willie's last hurrah, as he issues the Magna Carta again with a few upgrades to keep everyone happy, before becoming a Knights Templar on his deathbed where he passes away from illness in 1219 at the age of 72. Rising from a landless knight to one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom, serving 5 kings, surviving impossible odds, going on crusades and besting the Lionheart, Big Willie certainly did have a big willy. So one of the biggest medieval mad lads ever in the history of ever has to be King John the Blind of Bohemia, who suffered quite the end at the Battle of Crecy in 1346. As the battle between the English and French began heating up and shifting towards the English's side, the Bohemians, who were sided with the French, advised their King John that his life was now in danger if he stayed, and told him to get out of there as fast as possible and fight another day. King John, though, was like mama didn't raise no pussy, and he wanted to go into the battle where the crash of arms and vigour of war was at its loudest, and have a swing of his sword. Now, if you hadn't guessed at this point, King John the Blind of Bohemia was actually blind, and had been for the past 10 years, so he needed a bit of assistance to get into the melee, which is where 2 of his most loyal knights came in and agreed to take him where he and they would not return, as they tied all their horses together so they wouldn't lose him and charged into the battlefield. Although another chronicler does tell us it was less voluntarily from the knights and more of an order from John, as if they didn't do it, they would have been beheaded. King John's last order was that for his son, the future King Charles IV of Bohemia, to stay behind and be escorted off the field of battle, now being honoured as the new Bohemian king, as King John and his men galloped towards their end, with many of his other men following him in. While his end is told to us in heroic fashion in many of the tales, one other chronicler also suggests that he hit as many of his own troops as he did the enemy with his sword due to being blind, and we also know the gruesome reality of his end due to his skeletal remains. His heel had been sliced off, likely in an attempt to dismount him, and once he was dismounted, his elbow was also sliced, disabling his sword arm. A bladed weapon then pierced him while he was on his back through his left shoulder blade, before being turned over, with the fatal blow being a dagger through his visor, in ironic circumstance and blinding him again if he wasn't already blinding him enough. But King John did get his wish to die with a sword in his hand. Popular legend tells us that the 16-year-old Edward the Black Prince, who was heir to the English throne at the Battle of Crecy, was so moved by John's death he decided to adopt his crest as his own, which was the 3 ostrich feathers with the saying Ich dien in German, and I've probably mispronounced that, so apologies, which means I serve, which still stands today as the Prince of Wales crest. Of course, despite being such a great story, it seems to be just another myth, as there's no historical basis for it, as the first time that it's mentioned that it came from King John of Bohemia was on the Black Prince's death in 1376, 30 years after Crecy, and King John also had no such heraldry similar to this. It's believed the feathers belonged to his mother, Philippa of Hainault, as they first started appearing in 1328 when she married his father, Edward III. And the saying Ich dien is also likely to have come from his mother's Low Country heritage, or there is another alternative that it is Welsh for Ich dien, which sounds very similar and apparently means your man, which was a way to honour the Welsh archers at Crecy who done so much work on that battlefield.